because I do plan on keeping this. I do want to hold on to it for the long haul, and I know this will be challenging. I know that making this claim is probably really easy right now because I'm buying all the latest and greatest tech, but the real challenge is going to come next year when the iPhone 14 launches, and it's probably going to have a ton of features and maybe some stuff we weren't anticipating, but overall, I'm going to do my best to stay true to my word. I'll review the 14, but then I'll sell it or return it, find a good home for it, and keep using my 13 Pro Max. I'm sure many of you are still going to enjoy the iPhone 14 Pros when it comes out. I still plan on reviewing them for the channel, but I don't intend on keeping them. Like many of the products on this channel, I either sell them or return them and find a home for them where people can actually utilize and appreciate the features they're rocking. But I'm doubling down, even a couple months to go with the 13 Pro Max hitting 10 months old. Yes, I'm still very happy with it. Now, Drew, you cannot hit that return button. I'ma hit the return button. You call yourself an Apple sheep. How could you possibly think that about yourself if you're not using the iPhone 14 Pro Max? Yeah, I am the Apple sheep. You see this wall behind me? The wall doesn't matter, Drew, okay? What matters is you're using the latest and greatest and best technology from Apple. Well, that's the thing, Tim. This is the greatest from Apple. How dare you? Why would you even say that about our products? I mean, the best iPhone is the one you have with you, right? I'm gonna smack the crap out of you, I swear. I'm getting real here. Well, maybe you should have switched to Type-C a little bit earlier. Let's begin. You know, there's a lot of things to talk about with the iPhone 14 Pro Max, and I feel like every review has to dive pretty in-depth into the camera, so let's just rip off the Band-Aid and talk about the camera first and foremost. There's lots of other things to talk about, but yeah, the iPhone 14 Pro Max camera is kind of in a weird middle step. I mean, yes, I've taken quite a few pictures with it and videos with it, and I use my iPhone for work pretty daily at this point, especially over on Tailosive EV. That's where, like, essentially all the videos recorded on that channel are 100% shot on iPhone these days, and I use the ultra-wide lens, I'll use the telephoto lens, I'll use the main lens, depending on B-roll shots or far-away shots and everything, and while I'm sure the iPhone 14 Pro Max is the best the iPhone camera has ever been, and I appreciate a lot of the features they added to it, the higher megapixel sensor, the revival of the 2x button by just cropping in on that sensor, and action mode is fairly gimmicky, but I'm sure somebody who kind of treats their iPhone like a GoPro will probably make good use of it, and cinematic mode now supports 4K is great and all that, but side-by-side comparisons, maybe it's because I'm a YouTuber and I know a lot of my bit rates are going to be compressed by YouTube anyway, doesn't feel that drastically different from the 13 Pro Max. And you know what? I still think that's okay. I'm not saying that 1 year later Apple was supposed to have a massive step change improvement in the iPhone camera department, but that's part of the reason I'm not keeping the iPhone 14 Pro Max, and the reason I wanted to have a more long-term ownership experience with my 13 Pro Max, because year-over-year upgrades are not that major, and that's part of the reason Apple doesn't sell the 13 Pros anymore, because they know they're too in common with the 14 Pros. So yeah, with Apple Pro RAW, they will let you take advantage of the full 48 megapixel sensor, and I have taken a few photos with that, and, you know, if you're just looking at them, you know, without pixel peeping, they're not terribly different in my view. I still think that the 12 megapixel sensors were incredibly good on the old iPhones, and they're still very good on the ultra-wide and telephoto lenses as well, but Pro RAW takes up a lot of space and really is only useful, in my opinion, if you love to pixel peep. Some of you may do that. You take a picture and then you want to zoom in as much as you can and get as much detail out of that photo, but I guess I'm just not that type of guy to care. I feel like most people don't pixel peep, especially when the vast majority of all of our photos are being posted on social media and getting heavily compressed by Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, so you don't get to preserve most of that added quality anyway. The only times you really get to appreciate that is if you're taking photos off your phone and then, like, taking them to a computer and viewing them on a bigger screen, or maybe airplaying, but even there's compression with AirPlay to a certain extent. So it's cool, it's nifty, I'm not upset that it's there, but is it something I see myself using regularly? No, and frankly, I don't even think most people are gonna end up using Pro RAW regularly. And we took it on a little trip to a pumpkin patch, and we're taking a lot of pictures and taking a lot of videos with it, and maybe it's because of the HDR settings on the iPhone or something, something, but I was not overly impressed with the quality of just taking a normal photo, not in ProRAW, just a typical average, you open the camera app and snap a photo, and when viewing them on the iPhone, the colors looked a bit weird, and this is not just me being techie, you know, looking for a problem that's not there. I showed the pictures to my wife, and I didn't say anything about the colors, and even she made some comments like, yeah, what's up with this camera? She noticed the colors felt a little bit off, and 14 Pros so far have had a lot of bugs in the first launch, and maybe iOS 16 is gonna fix them down the road, but there were just several points where I took the picture and viewed them on the phone and thought, that looks kind of weird. That looks a little bit awkward. And yes, it's great that autofocus is now on the front-facing camera, but I even noticed times where I just whipped out the selfie camera to take a quick photo, and because of that autofocus, it felt like the background was a lot more blurry than I was used to it being. And yeah, I was in focus, and I looked really sharp, which is nice, but I don't know if that extra depth of field honestly starts to annoy people to a certain extent when you can't focus on two things at once as easily, maybe. That's not sure if that could be fixed with a software patch, but overall, I still feel like the 14 Pro camera is in this weird, like, middle ground, because cool, the 2x button is back, but now that I have the 2x button, the 3x feels very redundant. It's like you have a whole dedicated lens on this entire phone just to get, like, 30% more zoom, and because that sensor is still the regular 12 megapixel and it still doesn't have that great an aperture, it's like slightly better than digital zooming. So I guess for some people, you know, the best zoom you can get is what matters, but I still feel like if you're gonna have a dedicated telephoto lens and your main sensor can already zoom into 2x, it would make sense for the telephoto to be maybe a bit more than that, whether it's a 4x or a 5x. And Apple's been in talks with suppliers for years about doing a periscope lens that likely is coming. Maybe not next year, but at some point Apple's gonna have a zoom lens that can actually hold a candle to what we're seeing with the Galaxy phones with their space zooms, and Apple will probably refine it and make it work a lot more reliably and more simply. But the ultra-wide lens also did not get any massive improvements in my view. They claim the low light performance is a little bit better. I was having a hard time noticing. I'm sure in some specific example it might process the night mode photos a bit faster than the 13 does, but in regards to just how the image comes out, feels incredibly similar to me. I switched from recording my EV videos from the iPhone 13 to the 14, and all of the A-roll on that channel is shot with the ultra-wide lens. No one said anything. No one brought it up. No one was like, wow, this camera looks great. It was just, yep, just ultra-wide lens from an iPhone. That's pretty much what people are used to. But what I was grateful for, but still find myself wanting a little bit more, is cinematic mode supports 4K, so that's actually what this video is recorded at. I feel like that's the closest I can get to emulating my Blackmagic camera when I shoot on iPhone, but I'm not using the iPhone microphone for the record. I'm still using a dedicated mic for this review, but I would have liked to seen that option go all the way up to 4K at 60, because that's what my Blackmagic can do. And also, even if you don't like 60 frames a second, I know some people say like, well, cinematic is 24 FPS, but 60 FPS allows you to slow that footage down, which is when you can get really cool cinematic shots and slow-mo visuals of objects in motion or just people walking around or having a good time. When it's played back in slow-mo, it feels like you're watching some kind of fancy commercial. So even if you don't think 60 FPS is cinematic, it's still a good option to have. And in that case, 30 FPS isn't cinematic either, but they support that. So no changes with the ProRes department though, and while I'm still very overall impressed with the video performance on the iPhone, I don't see it as drastically different from the 13 Pro Max. So nothing really I've seen upgraded with the camera has made me feel like, oh, I need to keep this iPhone. This is so much better than my 13 Pro Max. It's got some cool, nifty advantages, but are they things I'm going to miss when I switch back to the 13 Pro? No. But moving away from the camera, now that we've got that out of the way, we have to talk about the dynamic island. It is so incredibly satisfying to see those visuals whenever I receive an airdrop, whenever I set a timer, whenever I'm listening to music and I want to quickly scrub through the song or pause or skip. It was a very, very decent surprise. This is absolutely one of those things that I wasn't expecting Apple to do, and it genuinely surprised me. And if I had to pick one thing that was my favorite feature about the 14 Pro Max, Dynamic Island has to be pretty high up there. But at the same time, after using this phone for about a week now, I can say that in my day-to-day usage of a smartphone, I don't run into a bunch of situations where the dynamic island actually gets to be utilized. And I still feel like it could be doing a lot more. I feel like they should bake Siri into dynamic island, or whenever I get a text message that could come out of dynamic island, but there's still a lot of scenarios where there's notifications dropping down, but they have to go past that whole pill cutout and everything. And I just love the animations and the display drivers for that island. I just feel like they don't get to be utilized enough. So it's great, and it decently surprised me, and I very much enjoy it more than the static peninsula on my 13 Pro, but the problem is in day-to-day usage, I'm not often setting that many timers, and even these days, I'm not really listening to music too frequently off of my phone, or if I am, I'm just playing it and then putting the phone down, so I'm not looking at it all too much. So it's cool, and I'm glad it's there, but there's been times where to access an old app or to access some old files on my 13 Pro, I've had to pick it up and start using it again, and I don't have that feeling that I used to when I upgraded my iPhone, you know? Like, when I upgraded to my 13 Pro, it was a very noticeable difference from my 12 mini. Not just because of the size, but particularly because of the refresh rate, which you guys know I'm a diehard fan of 120 hertz. So every time I picked up my 13 Pro, I was like, oh, this is so buttery, this is so smooth, I feel so at home here. And if I picked up my 12 mini again to access some old app or some old picture, I would be like, oh, yeah, I can tell this is my old phone. I don't want to keep using this one anymore. Whereas I don't have that feeling when I switch back to the 13 Pro. I still feel right at home. Maybe it's because it's the same size, but I'm not like, oh god, it still has a notch. There's no dynamic island anymore, because again, dynamic island doesn't get to be used as much as I'd like, and it still feels very snappy. It still feels very responsive, and I still have a great battery life with that phone. So as cool as it is, it's not necessarily upgrade worthy, considering I've already kind of gotten used to it, and the dynamic island has not wowed me as much after a week of usage. So it was one of those things that was really cool when it was fresh and new, but it's something that kind of blends into the background and you don't really think about it too much after a while. So I don't think I'm particularly gonna miss that after I return the 14 Pro Max. But on the subject of the display, one feature that I don't think gets highlighted enough, a lot of people want to talk about always on display, which I just, I couldn't get into it. I don't even have always on my Apple Watch because I feel like it wastes battery life, and the customization is not very good with always on display because it still feels very on, showing a lot of color, and it just was bugging me that I felt like my phone was on all the time. I would tap the power button again to try to shut it off, but then that would just wake it up, and I'm not the kind of guy that glances at my phone sitting off all the time. I have a watch if I want to check the time. I don't need that displayed 24/7, but what's really been appreciated, in my opinion, is the brighter display. So when you're outside, I guess it's only with certain circumstances, the 14 Pro Max can display up to 2000 nits brightness, and that was incredibly useful to me when all of the times I was using my phone outdoors. That just made me feel like, oh my god, I can see this display so much easier now, and that's genuinely something I could see myself missing when I go back to the 13 Pro Max. Again, I'm not using my phone outside too regularly, but it did happen a bit in the last week, you know, hanging out at the pumpkin patch or just walking down the street, checking out different grocery stores or running errands and stuff. When I was just grabbing my phone and using it outside, I definitely picked up on the brighter display, but the downside is it's usually not for very long. If you're using your phone for extended periods of time to preserve the quality of the display, I guess they have to dim it down again. So it can't sustain that 2000 nits for like hours and hours, but for the brief like 10 minutes or 15-minute windows that I'd be using my phone outside, the 2000 nits was excellent. I loved that. The battery life also seemed just perfectly adequate on my 14 Pro Max. In some of the compare pages, they said that it should last a little bit longer than the 13 Pro Max, but I've seen battery tests and it's kind of a toss-up. It sort of depends on what you're doing. Some battery tests had the 14 Pro Max outlive the 13 Pro Max, but other battery tests had the 13 Pro Max last longer, so it's just kind of dependent on what you're doing. I think that because of the improved LTPO panel on the 14 Pro Max that can go down to 1 hertz, maybe if you're doing more static things where the screen isn't showing a bunch of motion, the battery life could last longer. It probably outshines the 13 Pro if you turn off always on display, but if you don't turn off always on display, it probably doesn't last as long. But if we're just talking raw milliamp hour capacity, the 13 Pro Max still has a bigger battery life. So sorry, not sorry, but yeah, that makes me like it a little bit more. Also, because the 13 Pro Max only costs $69 to replace the battery, so that to me is a cost advantage to that older iPhone, whereas if you want to replace the battery in your 14 Pro Max, even though they improved the back glass replacement process, they made it easier to repair the iPhone 14 and everything, it costs $99 to replace your battery on the 14 Pro. So that kind of makes me want to continue holding on to the 13 13 Pro even longer. But there's clearly a lot of room for improvement on this iPhone, like the fact that you can have 1 terabyte of storage and record huge video files with ProRes and everything, but they still basically have done nothing again with the Lightning port. Huge amounts of storage and huge file sizes, but still USB 2.0 speeds, and that absolutely makes me want to wait and see what happens when Apple could adopt USB-C or ideally Thunderbolt on the iPhone. That, I think, would be a huge selling point, and the chassis is definitely in the realm of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's squared off, it's pretty bulky, it's pretty big, but it works. You know, these iPhones are selling incredibly well, and I'm still not really a fan of the stainless steel design. I would personally be fine with aluminum because I don't like fingerprints on things, but the silver color looks particularly good, and I think the space black has been a big winner in the color scheme, so I think Apple did a much better job with the iPhone 14 Pro colors. I wasn't really in love with graphite, but I just wanted a matte black iPhone, and graphite was the closest I could get. So I'm not willing to upgrade my iPhone just to have a slightly darker shade of gray, but I'm grateful for the improved color options, and I also think that switching to eSIM is going to be an annoyance at first, but in the long run we'll all benefit from it. Not in this generation though. I've seen the teardown. Basically the space that Apple would have put the SIM tray in on the iPhone 14, they just put a plastic box that does nothing. But I think that's not necessarily because they want to use that physical SIM space for added battery life or improved camera features. It's because they believe eSIM is safer and they think that's the future. So they're just trying to get people to switch over this year, and I think it makes sense that for overseas they still have the SIM tray, but in the US they removed it to kind of send a message to carriers around the world. This is where we're headed, so get ready, prepare for the eSIM transition, and maybe with the iPhone 15 series we'll have no SIM tray on any model, and that's when they can expand the battery capacity and the better camera, because I feel like if they did put something there in the US model, everyone would be ticked off that the battery life is better in the US version, or they stuffed an extra camera sensor in the US version, but the people overseas don't get that better battery life. Like, that would tick off a lot of people too, so it makes sense to keep the specs fair across the board, and the eSIM transition process was incredibly easy, and I'm sorry it hasn't been for all of you, but for a lot of you still, I see a lot of people saying, yeah, it just showed up in the setup process, and when I set up my new iPhone, boom, my phone number was already there, so I'm happy about that. I do think I'm just gonna keep it as an eSIM as well. I could contact Mint Mobile and ask them to port my number back to the physical SIM, but I see no point. I see no advantage to going back to the physical SIM, so I just plan on keeping it as an eSIM in my 13 Pro Max now. But I'm very curious as to what the future holds for the iPhone, because I feel like there's a lot of awkward stages here where it's like we have a 48 megapixel camera on the main sensor, but still 12 megapixel on the other lenses, and we have a 2x and a 3x button. Feels like periscope lens is right around the corner. Also, we're recording these huge file sizes, but we still have Lightning, so I'm very interested in covering all of the leaks and rumors for another year of iPhone coverage. But yeah, I'm still very much happy with the 13 Pro Max every time I pick it up. And the story I told on the tech podcast that really helped me decide that the 14 Pro Max was not worth keeping was my friend Randy texted me when I was still setting up my iPhone, and he said, is there a 2x button when you're doing portrait mode shots? Which I didn't think about. I was like, oh yeah, they said there's a 2x in the main sensor, but does that still work for portrait mode? So I went to the camera app and I went to the portrait mode and I tapped the 1x button and it just went straight to 3x. And I was getting ready to send the text back to Randy and say, hey, they didn't add the 2x button to portrait mode, which sucks. But as I was typing the message, I realized I was still using my 13 Pro Max because I still had both phones with me because I wasn't done setting up the 14 Pro Max. But it was like a solid minute or two of using my year-old iPhone without realizing that I wasn't using the 14 Pro Max. I thought I was. And I was like, this is my day one experience. If there's already times when this phone is brand new that I can't tell that I'm not using it, then that says a lot about how the ownership would go in the long haul. I could keep it, I could keep using it, but am I going to appreciate or utilize any of the added features? Maybe the brighter display. You know, I kind of appreciate the thinner side bezels all the way around, but enough to spend an extra couple $100 on the difference that it would be to sell my old 13 Pro Max to help cover the cost of the 14 Pro Max. Yeah, I don't think I'm gonna appreciate it that much. Ultimately, I've got my great battery life, I've got my 120 hertz, and I have a fantastic camera with my 13 Pro Max, so that's why I'm gonna continue using it. And suck it, everyone in the comments who kept saying you didn't believe me. So many people say, I do this every year. When the heck have I ever posted a video saying I'm not upgrading to this iPhone and then gone ahead and upgraded to it? I never did that with the iPhone XS, with the iPhone 8, with the iPhone 7. That's never happened, but so many of you are convinced it's happened. But just like how I review the Mac Studio, just like how I review the Studio Display or the M2 MacBook Air. There's a lot of tech products that come out that, of course, you guys want to know my thoughts on, and I want to try out myself, so I review them, and then after I'm done reviewing them, I'll either sell them to someone or I'll return them, and the iPhone 14 is no different. So I was worried. So many of you thought that because I was buying the new iPhone 14, that meant that I was keeping it and upgrading to it. No, I'm just reviewing it just like any other iPad or Apple Watch that comes out. I just try them out and let you know my thoughts, let you know if I think they're worth it or not, and then try to find a better home for them where someone can actually utilize their improved features. So there you have it. I'm factory resetting the iPhone shortly after recording this video. I hate to say I told you so, except this time. I love saying it now. I love my 13 Pro Max, and I'm gonna keep using it. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I'll see you all in the next one.